Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's just 3:30, so I don't want to start late and have everyone leave late. I'm Andrew Brandt. You may know me as Spike. I work at Sophos as a principal researcher, and I'm going to talk to you today about a couple of incidents that we investigated earlier this year involving some very weird social engineering attacks that led to some very weird malware attacks, all of which seemed a little bit over the top for the time. So, and there's a few George Clooney reaction GIFs within the talk, so I apologize in advance if you're not a fan. Briefly, I just want to do a land acknowledgement because I don't know if one has been done here, but this land where SAINTCON is taking place is named for the Ute tribe, is the unceded traditional and ancestral homeland of the Paiute, Goshute, Ute, Shoshone, and Navajo tribes, and has been a crossroad for indigenous peoples from time immemorial. I honored the territory upon which we gathered today by providing useful information that helps people avoid threats and stupid social engineering attacks. So a little bit about myself. I already mentioned that I am a researcher with Sophos in the XOps team. XOps is a group of people that are cross-departmental and work with our incident response, rapid response, managed data response, labs, data science, and a bunch of other teams within the company. We find interesting stuff and tear it apart to find research materials to present at conferences like SAINTCON. In addition to that, I volunteer in a number of different ways. I work for 1 day a week at a retro computing lab that's based at the University of Colorado at Boulder called the Media Archaeology Lab. A couple of you may have seen a talk I did 4 or 5 years ago about retro malware that ran on the Apple II and the Commodore 64. That's work that I've done through them. I was also a journalist for almost 20 years. I worked for daily newspapers, and then for 9 years I worked as an editor at PC World, covering security and privacy, writing a privacy column, occasionally doing the top 5 modems back in the day. And then there's something else, which is that I am currently finding a synergy with the education side of SAINTCON in that I am running for school board in my local community in Boulder, Colorado. So thank you so much. I think we do need to have more hackers in elected office at all levels. My plan is to run for office, win my seat, then go to DEF CON, SAINTCON, other cons, and do a talk about how to run for office yourself. I think hackers and people who are in this community are some of the most, not just the smartest, but some of the kindest and most generous and also innovative and creative people that I've met. And we need more of that at all levels of government and especially in our schools. So let's talk about what we're talking about here, which is really stupid stuff. So this was social engineer attacks. There were 2 of them that we investigated. And what we found out, and I guess this is kind of a spoiler alert for the rest of the talk, is that you don't have to have a team of 20 people and a pinch and elaborate hacker skills to be able to conduct these kinds of social engineering attacks. It does help, but when you do those things, it is certainly a little over the top because it seems like most people will just fall for it if you come across as sort of a workaday schlub. And these things were extremely effective because of that. So let's talk about the first attack. Earlier this year, just in the beginning of the year, we started to see that there were attacks that were targeting small accounting firms that mainly do tax preparation for people. So we're talking sometimes just 1 or 2 employees. Oh, dramatic. The way that the attack started was like this. So if you know malicious spam and you know how attacks usually begin of this nature, you know that usually you would get someone who would send you a weaponized file, a Word document that has some script in it. You might get a zip file with something in it. But no, the way that this one started was just a straight email from someone who seemed like they were kind of in a rush because this email was sent in February and they're desperately looking for someone to do their taxes for them. And so they were just saying, hey, you're a tax accountant, I got referred to you. Are you taking new clients? And only after the person who they sent the email to responded, did the attacker bring in the heavy guns and start the kill chain here. So what we saw was that in the reply to the accountant's reply, the attacker would send some information about themselves, because usually what would happen was an accountant, if they were taking new clients, they would say, well, send me your last year's tax return. So this guy had already knew that was, anticipated that was going to be the question that the people asked, and they went out of their way to have that ready for them in the form of a link to a zip file. This was cool because it evaded our spam traps by not having the link in the initial message. So clue number one, that it was an attack that was a little bit more sophisticated, was that they were able to get around. They knew that if they had sent this link in the first email, spam filter would have killed it. But because they had had this engaged, communication with the person already, that history of the email conversation allowed it to get through. So it linked to a zip archive, but it was not a normal zip archive. So it had two files inside of it. It was purporting to be the person's tax returns from the previous year. And so what they would send was a zip that had two files in it, one of which was an image file, I use air quotes. And then the other thing, which was a PDF, also in air quotes, because you can see here in the little black box that was, it was no PDF, it was a Windows shortcut. And if you're familiar with the way that Windows does file suffixes, you can check a little box in the Explorer preferences that allows you to see file suffixes for known file types, but the one file type that doesn't work for is a Windows shortcut. So it always hides the .lnk that's at the end. And so if you do the double file extension and the file is a Windows shortcut, it still is a functional shortcut, but it leaves the PDF in there. The only clue that you have that it's a shortcut is the little tiny arrow that's on the icon that indicates it's a shortcut. The other file, by the way, also was not an image, right? So there was one where we got one that was called private copy.pdf and another one where it says screenshot 1242.jpg. They were not what they say they were. In fact, what they were was the JPEG file, and the thing that was an actual PDF was a renamed MP3 file, and it was, in fact, this exact MP3 file that I'm going to play a clip of it for you right now. So this was about a 3-minute long audio recording, and it sounds like, and I think we've pretty much confirmed at this point that the musical instrument that is being played is called an oud. It's a stringed instrument similar to a lute. It's played very widely in the Middle East. Just a little bit of a strange, twitch to this. So we weren't able to figure out what the name of the song was, but we recognized the instrument. And of course, because the file is not a JPEG, is not a PDF, when you double click it, Adobe Reader would pop up a message that said, hey, this document isn't readable. Your image reader would do the same thing. So then you would go and click the other thing, the Windows shortcut. And that's where the real trouble started. So in this case, I am the kind of person who likes to double click bad stuff, but we want to look at where we were going to be going before we, double clicked it. So you right click, you do properties, and normally it shows the URL, or in some cases it's a PowerShell script or some other kind of script that's in the that target field. But in this case, you can see that the target field is blank, and that is kind of wild, right? So we didn't know what was going on with this. How did they do that? Well, apparently, and this is fun, about 18 months ago, a security researcher who goes by the handle x86 Matthew published a nice blog post explaining that he had discovered an exploit in Windows that allows someone to conceal the contents of the target field in a Windows shortcut. And he reported it to the MSRC, and they said, not a bug. So he then went ahead and published a blog post that explains the entire thing. This is the bug. It's a bunch of null bytes prepended to the command line with the character for a carriage return in there. And you can see when you look at it, it's just this big blank space that precedes a PowerShell command that starts with invoke web request. And when you look at this with a hex editor, you can actually see it just fine. I've given you like a kind of broken out version of it at the bottom there, and you can see it's going to http://0xc2.11808.979. Is that a URL? That is so weird. So they crafted this unique looking URL, and it was basically, as I've shown here, I've kind of broken it down into a summary. It was 0x and 2 hexadecimal bytes, .8 or 9 digits, and then the rest of the URI. So they've done something with the domain or the IP address, and they've done it in this weird way. And I looked at it and I thought, God, that is so familiar. And I've been doing tech and covering security for so long. I recognized this, but I couldn't be 100% sure just how old it was. But in fact, it was really, really old. The first part of the URL was the first octet of the IPv4 address converted into hexadecimal. And the second part of the address that was in the URL, the string of numbers, was what we call a D-word format dotless IP address. And this was really wild. I haven't seen one of these in a really long time. Let's talk about what that is. So dotless IP addresses, one of the oldest vulnerabilities that I ever did research on, both as a journalist and then later as a security researcher. So they were first discovered in 1998, and they were used to create a bypass to the security zones feature in Internet Explorer 4. So the very first CVE or bug ticket that was ever filed for a dotless IP address was called MS98016, and that was back in October of 1998, or 25 years ago. This bug is now old enough to buy us all a beer at the bar. And then there was another later version that came out that affected Internet Explorer 5 and 5.5 and 6 that came out a couple of years after that. So very weird, really old bug, but this is why it works. So here's a little bit of where we go into the media archaeology side of malware research, is that this is goes to the core of how IPv4 addresses are created. So back in September of 1981, when a group that was working on RFC 791 was building out the spec for how an IPv4 address worked, they basically said, it is a 32-bit number. And we all know today that the 32-bit number is represented as 4 decimal representations of 8 bits of data, so 1 byte for each what we call octet, separated by dots, and that is what is now known as the dotted decimal IPv4 address. One fun thing about if you try to browse to an IPv4 address is that now we live in this modern world where most websites are using HTTPS. Back in the HTTP days, you could just browse right to it, no problem. However, in our modern world, where everything has got an SSL or TLS certificate associated with the domain that you're visiting, unless the IP address is part of that certificate, the web browser will throw an SSL or TLS error. And as you can see here in this screenshot of Internet Explorer 4.5 running in a Mac emulator, it does not work. So you cannot browse to modern HTTPS websites with this type of address. So back in the day, back in 1999, when I was working on this and still an editor at PC World, and I have to admit, I am not a programmer. I studied English in college and do not have any technical education credentialing of any kind. Yes, this is hope for people to get into the security field who are in the humanities, and I wish you luck. It is possible. but I love to hack on things, and I'm very good with Excel. So I created this spreadsheet in Excel that's basically a calculator. And the way that it works is it takes the dotless IP, which was a string of numbers, converts it to its hexadecimal value, the 32-bit hexadecimal value, and then it takes each of the 2 hexadecimal chunks and breaks it into its dotted decimal portion, and then reconverts each of those back into the decimal version. So, 7F is 127. When we were looking at this one, we were noticing that, the first octet, it was hex, but then the rest of it was decimal. And so what you can do with that is use the same methodology for the first octet, where you basically just convert the hex back to the decimal number. But then for the last 3 octets in the IPv4 address, you can imagine that number is all run together. If you convert that into hexadecimal, break out those hexadecimal pairs, and then you convert that back into decimal, that is how you end up with a decimal IP address. And we saw that there were a lot of these shortcuts when this attack was going on, and we started looking for more spam that was hosting the links to these bad files. We were finding tons of them, all of them hosted basically on 3 different IP addresses, but lots of different variations of them. And I think as I mentioned, they were all in HTTP, so they had to be hosted on a website on an IP address, and it had to be hosted over HTTP, not HTTPS, in order to prevent the user from throwing an error. So as we were doing more research on this, so I presented this talk at DEF CON, and then afterwards we were doing more research to see if there were other incidents in which threat actors had been using strange formats of IPv4 addresses in their in attacks of any kind. We did find a spam campaign at the end of August in which you can see at the bottom here that there's a highlighted URL that was this huge sale, 70% off for a limited time, and the URL looks like it's http ://0x14.0121.0x27.0174. And that is yet another method that I was not even aware of, which is base 8 or octal. So you can for any of these octets in a dotted decimal IP, you can convert them into hex, and as long as you use 0x at the beginning, it will work. Or you can use it in base 8 octal and convert it to an octal value, and in order to use that in a dotted IP address, you just have to precede it with a 0. And it was just incredible to see that these methodologies are in place, because what happens is the URL is only exists in this format in the email message, or in the case of the other thing, in the shortcut. But the TCP/IP stack, when it reads this, automatically converts it to the dotted decimal, and it just knows that it's actually on a particular IP address. And so we used this. The IP address that's listed here is not the malicious one. It's for a website called The Old Net, and it's useful because you can use it to browse to old websites on retro computers. So at the other end of that weirdness was even more weirdness. There's this gigantic script with enormous values that are part of variables, and a script that basically just dumps out the variables and decodes them into something that looks more like the inset screenshot that's right here. It was very, very heavily obfuscated and was almost 200K in size. When we got out of that, we ended up with a Visual Basic script that was about 150K in size. And most of that was 2 variables. The variables were named IR8 and 07, and they're kind of referenced. You can see like IR8 is right here at the bottom of the screen. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because they work in tandem to insert data into the Windows registry and to execute PowerShell. So here's how that works. So the IR8 script, when it is decoded, the IR8 variable is another PowerShell script, which the VBS decodes and then executes. And that PowerShell script that gets decoded from the IR8 variable uses reflection.assembly to load the final payload from memory. and it writes it into registry without writing it into the disk, which is really weird. Why would you want to write something into the registry? So the script that's shown here, it converts a bunch of small strings into bytes, and then it concatenates the output. It does a BXOR to decode the bytes, and then it converts those bytes back into ASCII text before it sticks them into the registry as ASCII text. So very, very heavily obfuscated. And then the content that comes out of that is what comes from the 07 variable. It's only shown in part because it's so big, and it's way too big to show on one whole screen. It's a bunch of chunks of a variable that are concatenated together. Huge base 64 value, and what it does is it makes a bunch of changes to Windows. So it creates a user level environment variable that we can see here is called saltoq, which points at PowerShell. It created some other data as well. Some other things in the registry, which I will show you in a moment. So that saltoq variable was then used to invoke PowerShell in a way that didn't actually show that PowerShell was running, because you could just use saltoq instead of PowerShell.exe. And then you would execute something that it created a run key in the registry called overproduce, and that invoked the saltoq variable to run a PowerShell script every reboot. And that run key references a different registry key in hkeycurrent user clog-like that contains a portion of the same Visual Basic script code that was in the original VBS payload, so that basically it is persistent, and all of these components are just embedded in the registry, waiting to be executed and sort of loaded into memory with filelessly. So really clever and really kind of scary. And what you see here is that it was actually invoking a process called IE low util, which it was injecting it using process hollowing into that process, and that's the now defunct Internet Explorer utility for adjusting the microphone volume on a Windows machine. So really glad that was still there. We did actually also see it hooking into IE install.exe as well. And that's the piece that installs add-ons into Internet Explorer. Again, so grateful that that's still part of Windows. So that was that attack, right? So talk about all that involved labor to just basically deliver a malware. And by the way, the malware was something called GooLoader, and it is just a botnet that steals passwords and sits and waits for commands. It's really nothing special, kind of a commodity botnet, but boy, does it have the weirdest way of ensuring persistence and for staying on the machine. Now I want to talk about an even weirder attack, and this one involved a telephone call. So let's set the stage. So in this case, we found out about the attack after it had taken place. So it had transpired, about 3 weeks before we were called in and asked to do an incident response report on it. And what we found out from interviewing staff at the company where this happened was that the employee got a call, mid-morning on a Friday morning. No one else was in the office. And so this person just answered the phone, and the person who was calling said, hey, I'm a delivery driver. I've got to get a package. It's got urgent markings on it that say it need to be delivered today. It says it's being delivered from a government customer of yours, so seems like it's really important. There's no one at your other satellite office, and I was wondering if I could bring it to you. And of course, the employee's going to be like, yeah, of course, sure, why not? It was a company that was based in Switzerland. They had offices in Switzerland and Germany. The person who was calling them spoke German perfectly without an accent. So it was very interesting. The caller told the person that they were calling at the target of this attack okay, so we're gonna redirect the package to you. You are going to receive an email in one moment that is going to contain a confirmation number, and that is our way of validating that you are the correct person to receive this package. And I would like you to just open that thing up and read the number to me. Can you guess what happened next? So it was a very, very weird attack, right? The person who received the phone call never gave the caller their email address. So they just got this email while the caller was still on the phone with them, having never, told the person their name or given them their email address. So it was very weird. At this point, it felt very targeted. But the person who received the call was just trying to be supportive and wanted to, get their package delivered. So here's the summary of this, right? They called them. They asked them to read the code from the message. They get this email that has a file, and then the target has to open the file that's attached to the message to read the tracking number or whatever it is. And then what was happening in the background was something was getting downloaded onto the target's machine. It was really bad. So here's what the message was that this person received. It looked like it was coming from this local shipping company called TD Express. A company based in Switzerland, email written in French, not that unusual. French, English, and German, I believe, are 3 official languages of Switzerland. It was not unusual to receive a message that was written in French. What was interesting about this is that the entire content of the email message was one big static JPEG image. So everything that you see here, all of the text, and even the little thing that shows envoy, which means attachment in French, even that icon that looks like an attachment was part of the image that was embedded in the email message. So none of the text of the email was readable by a spam filter or any kind of tool that would have, profiled it for malicious content. But the entire image was all hot linked to one URL. By the way, you can see in the email it says that the package is about 0.157 kilograms, which is about what a manila envelope would weigh, right? And it says it has elevated government agency priority, or élevé agence gouvernementale. So what was the problem? As I mentioned, it was just one big image. So that's the link that it was linked to. So the entire image, everything within the body of everything below the headers, basically, was hot linked to this website. And if you can see the website, if it's not too hard to read, you can see that it was actually it was a real website that belonged to a legitimate business. They have an ad service that they use on their website to display ads, and that ad service had a redirection script that it used, which was vulnerable to just being injected with whatever URL anybody wanted to redirect to a different website. So again, what they were able to do was hot link to a benign website, which then the website redirected to the attacker's site where the payload was hosted, which was safedelivery-company.com. And that's, everybody knows that's got to be legit, right? So when you, here's the page that showed the redirect and the pointing to the payload. We also found that the attackers were using not just Safe Delivery Company, but also aircourier-company.com. And all of the URIs were pointing at something that had in its file name tracking_pack_ch, the characters for Switzerland, and then a string of numbers. And what would come back was the payload. So at this point, this is all we know of how the attack transpired. The victims did not still have all of the files that they were delivered. And as part of our postmortem investigation, we do interviews with the people who were in the middle of this. We then also try to go to all of the URLs that we saw that were part of sort of the browsing history of the target's machine. It was not there at the time when we went to go look for it. We got this React.js template that we see a lot in malicious sites that have been up for a short amount of time and then get taken down again. It's a template called Deadline, and it still contained the literal lorem ipsum text of because it's a template for a countdown timer. So it literally says lorem ipsum, we are coming soon. So nothing there. Yes, it was very clever. after that, we started to look at whatever files that were still remaining on the machine. So one of the things that we found that was really strange, and the target had no explanation for it, is that the attacker, they only had access to the machine for about 15 minutes, right? So what happened was the caller got suspicious because they knew that the other office where the shipping person was supposed to be delivering previously was only about 10 minutes away. And after 15 minutes, when they didn't show up and they were expecting them to show up, they got a little bit spidey senses tingling. They called their IT security team. IT security said, pull the Ethernet jack out of the back of your machine and we'll be right down. And that was basically how they saved the day. So in the 15 minutes that the attacker was on the machine, they downloaded, they ran, they deleted a bunch of PowerShell scripts. They also deleted the original executable. We found some flow logs, but we didn't have a lot of other data. Pointed to a few IPs and websites, but nothing that was, useful, because as you saw, it just went to this like React.js template. There was nothing hosted there anymore. But they did leave behind, for some strange reason, and the target confirmed this, that they had never installed Notepad++ on their machine, but there was the entire directory with the portable installation of Notepad++ in the place where it would normally have been installed under program files, and they did not know how it got there. There were a bunch of things that were wrong with the installation of Notepad++. It had all of the normal files. Many of them, though, most of it is signed code. It had been signed with a different certificate. We don't know why. It was using a certificate that had a different company's name on it. In addition, there were a bunch of other files that were in the directory with Notepad++ that should not have been there. It was like this. So normally, there is, on every installation of Notepad++, there's an updater folder, and in that folder is basically a couple of scripts and a DLL to do the downloading of the updates, and that is it. Inside of this one, you can see that there were something like 15 additional files that aren't normally included with a legitimate copy of Notepad++. So in addition to the normal files, there was a DLL that Windows uses to create scheduled tasks that have been renamed to something different. There was an unsigned copy of the curl library named libperl.dll. There was a Windows executable version of, at least in this case, a potentially unwanted Linux app called SOCAT, whose developers describe it as a relay for bidirectional data transfers between two independent data channels. Sounds useful to an attacker. And then, of course, the minimally required files that were necessary to open a connection to Tor, aka the dark web. So all of this stuff was messed with, and all of these additional files were in there, but everyone here knows that Notepad++ is an open source file that's released under the GPL license agreement. And of course, because it's an open source product and it's released under this license, it has something called license.txt in this folder. And license had some weird stuff in it. Check this out. So these are the worst licensing terms ever. It was the entire GPL, and then appended to the end of it was something like 59K of base64 encoded data. And why did it do this? Because the base64 encoded data, when we decoded it, contained a PowerShell script, and then that PowerShell script contained blobs, which decoded into other PowerShell scripts. So we had PowerShell scripts in PowerShell scripts in PowerShell scripts. And in addition to that, some of those PowerShell scripts included a data representation in base64 of a certificate authority certificate that the kind of thing that you would install into the browser if you are visiting a web page and you wanted to have a secure HTTPS connection. So this chain of things that would run, so if you ran the script, it would decode the first level of the rest of the scripts, and then the first one would run a script that would add that CA certificate into the Windows certificate store so that it would be loaded, and then it would run a second script that would do the same thing, but it would stick it in Firefox because Firefox is special and they have to have their own certificate store that's separate from the operating system's one. So they wanted to make sure that it was also installed in Firefox, and then the third thing was that it would create a scheduled task that would start up a Tor connection, and it would open, using SOCAT, it would open a reverse shell to address on Tor, over Tor from the target's machine. So super fishy stuff. Here's what that certificate, looked like, and the script looked like that was setting up the scheduled task. So you can even see that the script said, get Firefox path from registry, right? Like they had planned this because they wanted to make sure that they could use either browser and that they could have the certificate installed in either browser. By the way, the certificate appears to be legitimate, right? Because certificate authority Komodo is a real CA, but this one was not issued by them. It was not legitimate. And in fact, the information box said this CA root certificate is not trusted. Of course, everyone here, you all look very carefully at all your CA root certificates before you run something, right? Like we all do that. Yeah, no, of course not. And, so this is clearly bad, and it's clearly been crafted to do some bad stuff. So in a previous career, at a previous company, the company made a product that did on a mass scale, a network level, machine in the middle TLS decryption. And the way that worked was you had to generate a custom private key with a CA cert, and then you had to take that private key and install it on the browser and the certificate store of every machine you wanted to do interception on. And that was the way that you were able to silently and without throwing any errors re-sign TLS data so that the browser thought it was secure, the website thought it was secure, but somewhere in the middle you're able to get to the contents in the middle of that. We suspect that the reason that they were going to all this trouble was that they wanted to do TLS interception, and they were going to send whatever they intercepted out to this Tor address that they were connecting to. In addition, there were other files that were left behind. There was this PowerShell script called ms.ps1, and the attackers failed to delete it, but what it did was it did this massive profiling of every characteristic, every piece of software that was installed, the location of QuickBook files, of cryptocurrency wallets, of saved passwords, cookies, browser plugins for 8 different browsers. In fact, every major browser that I could think of, Firefox, Opera, Edge, Brave, Chrome, Chromium, Vivaldi, and of course the QQ browser, which everybody loves. And the script also contained an embedded list of 53 websites that it was using to pull out of the cookies that were saved on the machine and look for cookies and save credentials specifically for these websites. So the target was based in Switzerland, and strangely enough, there was the Swiss retailer Tutti, which is like their version of Amazon, and a bunch of websites associated with cryptocurrency companies. I think you can see ftx.com was in there. But there were also a bunch of web addresses for banks that are based in Australia, which is like, okay, so we know Australia and Austria, sometimes people get them mixed up. Not really sure what was going on there. But we started to do a little bit of OSINT hunting because we really wanted to figure out where this was coming from. And the way that we figured it out was we looked for more copies of that weird license key that we found in Notepad++. And we would look, you just do a search on the hash in VirusTotal, and you would say, show me all of the archives and other sources where this file had been located. And boom, we found this executable that was called envoy_n01670 and a bunch of numbers.exe. It had this weird icon. And when you double clicked it, it showed a window that looked just like this that says delivery tracking, with a button in the very center that says show information. So this was just an Electron app, right? A fully self-contained Chromium browser with just some scripts and graphics and things to make it render a web page as like a standalone application. And when we went back to the target in this attack and we showed them this, they said, yes, that was the thing that the guy sent me. So we're on the right track. So we open this up, And in fact, we found that it does, when you click that button that says show me the tracking number, it does show a tracking number, but it does a whole lot more. So we did see that it contained that full installation, the portable installation of Notepad++, and it drops it in the location where the victim had it on their machine. It does the thing where it opens up a connection to Tor, and it basically is listening on a special port over Tor for inbound connections. It did run the scripts that we saw that were in those like nested PowerShell that installed the CA certificates in the browser, and then just sat there listening, waiting for an inbound connection, right? It also tried to connect to a URL for a file that was hosted in Google Drive, but when we tried to go to that URL, by then Google had already taken it down. It was disabled. It wasn't functional. So all of this happened in the background as soon as the attacker convinced the target to click the show more information button, right? Got them to read this 12-digit number over the phone like it was some kind of actual thing. And they did, and then, nothing happened after that, so that was when everybody got suspicious. So we did find, as I said, we went on VirusTotal, we were doing this sort of hunt to find more stuff. We found more scripts that were sort of linking to the similar Electron apps. Basically, they were the same scripts, but they had different variable names. And they all contained the same fake CA certificate that we had found on the target's computer. So we were definitely like in the right range here for this attack. Once we showed them all of this stuff, they said, wow, that was really elaborate for what they really, were trying to do. So what we've seen is that we have two social engineering attacks that went way overboard in terms of like their engagement with the customer. Then we had two malware attacks that went way overboard in their ability to try to conceal what they were doing and engage in stuff surreptitiously. It was way beyond what anyone needed to do. So let's talk about like, what do you do for people who still like answer their telephone? Do people actually answer the phone? I didn't realize that still happened. I call my kids and I know that they're not interested in answering the phone. So, we do realize that like you don't need to have a really incredibly like sophisticated backstory for social engineering attacks to happen. What you do is you use human nature. People want to be helpful, and you are going to use that desire to be helpful to convince them to do something that is not in their best interest, right? So, the advice that we give people is to reflexively be suspicious when a stranger is calling you on the telephone. It is not the time to be, reaching deep into your well of being a good person and offering to help them with anything that happens if there's someone you've never spoken to before. We always encourage people to be communicating with their IT or their security teams when stuff like this happens, even if it is not a routine thing. It is always valuable for IT security teams to cultivate a good relationship with the rest of the company. I cannot tell you how often people are afraid to report something bad happening because they think they're going to get into trouble. And that is something that happens because the IT security team has led them to believe that if they report something bad, it means that they've done something bad. So the way that you do this, the way that you solve this problem, is you cultivate an open communication channel in which people feel safe and comfortable and not worried about getting fired because they clicked the wrong link in a phishing test or in some other kind of malicious email. And we just need to tell people that, hey, we told you before, you need to be careful about opening Word documents that you get from some random person who says they're sending you a bid. Now we need to explain to people that they also need to be careful about answering the phone and talking to people who they don't know, who are trying to convince them over the phone to do things that they don't want to do. Like just, how about you validate yourself before you ask me to validate who you are? Can you give me your company's HQ phone number so I can call them and ask them to route the package, or anything like that would have been beneficial. But yes, the employee who was in this case, they deserve a commendation because they did the right thing. They had quick thinking. Their IT team had already cultivated this good working relationship with them. They knew that they could call and let them know that something was amiss. And in this case, they did, and it stopped the attackers in their tracks 15 minutes into their attack. It could have been much, much worse. So that is my talk. Here are some references. So this is the screen if you want to take a picture of it, to screenshot with all the links to our blog posts about this and our research papers about this. We also publish all of our IOCs for anything that we do research on in which there is malware involved. And then, of course, if you wanted to read up about some 25-year-old security vulnerabilities in Internet Explorer 4, there are the links to the bulletins that still exist on Microsoft's website. Had to ask them specially to please make those links function again because they were so old they had been turned off. So that's my talk, and I will stick around if you've got questions. Thank you so much for coming.